All right, so welcome everyone to version 12 of the Heroes Lecture Part 2. Part 1, we discussed this phenomenon called the hero's journey. This is, you can think of it like a composite meta-narrative that Joseph Campbell put together. And we talked about examples of this. And this is something that Campbell called mankind's one great story. So, um, what we're going to talk about today is how do we see the hero's story in other disciplines of study, that we want to try to validate the hero's story, the hero's journey in some way. What are some other ways we can find evidence of this story? So that's part two. Just how real is this story, right? That's kind of the idea. Now, just to summarize, so again, the hero's journey is a composite narrative. It's comprised of the main narrative patterns that were found in mythologies around the world. So he took a survey, basically, he read through probably thousands of different mythologies from all manner of civilizations, from jungle tribes to sprawling Greek civilizations to the civilizations of today. And he identified these common narrative patterns. And so it's kind of like he constructed this narrative out of all those narrative patterns, all those different I guess, story patterns, you could say. And he put it together and he called it mankind's one great story. And basically his idea is this. Look, we have all these different stories, right? We're caught in this web of narratives, all these different religions, all these different beliefs about the most important questions of our lives. Like, who are we? What are we doing here? Where do we come from? What is our purpose here? And basically he said, okay, well, look, we have all these different versions of the truth, right? But what are the commonalities between them? Is there a story that we all tell together? And his theory is that there is a single narrative that we all seem to be telling, and it's comprised in this sort of Frankenstein, this pieced together narrative. He calls it the hero's journey, because this is a story that we keep telling over and over again. And so it's a universal narrative because we all tell it, but it's also a grand narrative. Grand in the sense that it communicates to us the deepest sense of who we are. It tries to contextualize us and tell us, okay, this is the meaning of your life, right? So this is a grand narrative. And in some sense, it's definitional of what a grand narrative is. So basically he's trying to figure out this dilemma, right, of like all these narratives, all these mini narratives that the Christians say this and the Hindus say this and the Muslims say this and atheists and agnostics, right? We all have these different stories, and he's like, well, what about the story that we all tell together? Wouldn't that kind of settle the argument, as it were? So he has this thesis about a grand narrative, right? This hero's journey. And in it, he makes a number of grand proclamations. Basically, he asserts that the meaning of life is really comprised in three elements. He says that it has to include morality, transformation, and transcendence. That all the narratives that we tell around the world contain the stories that we elevate to the top, the ones that persist, that tell the grand story of who we are. They always contain epic elements of morality, transformation, and transcendence. And basically his premise is that how do we know what the story of our lives is? Well, it must be the one that we all tell. Like, what's the story that captures our attention? And what's the story that captures not just one group's attention, but all of our attention and holds it and persists? So that's kind of the idea. It's sort of a sociological experiment, you could say. It's you could call it like a top-down approach to try to figure out the meaning of life. And when we're talking about the meaning of life, really what we're talking about is purpose. Because if you're saying like what's the meaning of my life, what you're really asking is what's the purpose of my life. If you're asking like who am I, what you're really asking is why am I? What am I supposed to be doing here, right? And narratives, he turns to a narrative to tell us that, because narratives include all those questions. You think about what a narrative is, what the bare bones of a narrative are. It's going to be character, setting, motivation, and then the movement of those three things through time. Character, setting, motivation, three elements of a narrative, and these are kind of like the three structural elements of meaning. So I think Joseph Campbell, I think he was on the right track in the sense that I think it is probably a narrative that will communicate the meaning of who we are, because that includes our identity. It's an explanation for the world that we're in. And then it tells us what the right motivation is. What's our deepest motivation? And it's interesting that we don't really know this. It's a bit of a mystery, and we're kind of a mystery to ourselves. And that's going to be thematic as we look at what other disciplines of study say about the meaning of our lives. So we're going to do a bit of cross-referencing, and we're going to say, okay, Joseph Campbell, he took sort of a top-down approach. And in some sense, you could say it's kind of an approach of opinions. Like he kind of did a survey, hey, what do you think the meaning of life is? And he asked all these different cultures, and he tried to find the commonality between these answers. Now, some of you, that might be very convincing. For me, I think it's really interesting. But it may not, seal the deal, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just people's opinion. And people's opinion change, and they're subjective, right? Subjective. What about other fields of study? For example, science, right? Now, the reason why science, I think, fits in with, if we're trying to validate, if we're trying to look for meaning, the story of our lives in other disciplines, I think science is interesting because that's more of a bottom-up approach. Because if the top-down is saying, well, what do people say our meaning is, the bottom-up is well, what about the organism itself, right? Because when we're talking about grand narratives, what we're talking about is purpose. Meaning and purpose are synonymous. The purpose of our lives. What about the purpose of the organism? What about the purpose of the design, right? That's more of a bottom-up approach. And I think one thing that we love about science, not to, never mind all the things that it's done for us, like YouTube or the internet on electricity, is that there's something about it that feels a lot less opinion-based than perhaps something sociological or philosophical. That it's kind of like there's this discipline of non-biasness that it doesn't always work out, but that we look at sets of data and then we interpret these sets of data, but people can't generally argue about the data. And so it's kind of unbiased. And so it's kind of like, well, what would a scientist say about the meaning of our lives? If we look at the bottom-up approach, the design of our system, what is our meaning? What's our purpose? And do we see any convergence between this top-down, this hero's journey, and any kind of and what our physiology points to? What does our design say? Because it's kind of like if you were an alien and you landed on planet Earth and you've never seen a hammer before. Now, you might conclude some things about the hammer that would be a lot different than your conclusions about a nail, just by looking at the design, right? You wouldn't need to know the context. You wouldn't need to ask anyone. Just through your own study of the design, you could draw some conclusions about what the purpose would be of the hammer versus the nail, or this physiology. So we're going to take a bottom-up approach to see if there's any kind of convergence between the hero's journey and, let's say, the biological imperatives that are built within our system, something like that, right? All right, so let's take a look at it. When we're talking about purpose, right, what we're talking about essentially is survival. I mean, certainly the purpose of the design is to survive in some way, is to adapt. So it's a question of adaptability. Now, you can look at adaptability from a couple ways again. It's kind of saying this is the state of the world. How do we find our way? How do we find our place in the world such that we adapt to the world? That we're that we're able to satisfy our needs in the most efficient way possible, right? How does the organism find a way to adapt to the world? That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is like, in some sense, the world sets these conditions. It like asks these questions, right? Like here's the setting, here are the conditions, here's the criteria. Okay, now find a way to survive. Find a way to thrive in this environment. And it's kind of like the world molds you through its I guess through its inflexibility, right? It is the way it is, and so how do we deal with it? How does the world mold us into itself? How has the world shaped our physiology such that we have found a way to survive? Like what is our place in the world from a biological perspective? Where do we see that in our design? Simple examples like we have these fingers, right, with an opposable thumb, and they're capable of very fine-tuned motor movements. This must be one way that we're supposed to adapt to the world. We have such skill with our hands. What can we do with them? Right? We can make tools? We can, right? And never mind consciousness. So speaking of consciousness, so how is it that what's the fundamental way in which our physiology coordinates with the world? How does that work? Well, essentially, now, when we're born, when we're conceived, in the first 4 weeks of conception, there's two main systems that come online. The first one is the heart and the cardiovascular system. So that's a network of veins that feed oxygen and circulation throughout the organism. And then the second one is going to be the nervous system. And that's what controls and regulates the system. And just like the network of veins that stretches through the body, we have a network of nerves that stretches through the body. So these nerve pathways are pretty much divided up into two different operational systems. There's a fundamental duality within our physiology that needs to coordinate, and this coordination is how we survive, how we find a way to adapt to the world. What do you think this fundamental duality is? What's the fundamental duality of our physiology? What do you think it is? Poetically, colloquially, you could say it's like mind and body, right? Our mind coordinates with our body, vice versa. Somehow this dance between mind and body is more or less how we match ourselves to the world. On a technical level, what do we really mean by mind and body? I think what we really mean by mind is voluntary. It's what we decide to do, what we are aware of, and the decisions that we consciously make. So we have our voluntary systems. And then the rest of it is body, which is involuntary. That's the stuff we don't really control. All the stuff that happens below our conscious awareness. And in fact, most of who we are, in some sense, is below conscious awareness. Like our spleen, our blood pressure, like all these, our heart, lungs, and stomach, all these things, even our somatic, right, our somatic control, we control it, but I don't know how this is happening. It's not like I'm consciously fire off this electrical neuron to trigger this movement, right? It just happens. I don't know how it happens. And so in some sense, like, our consciousness is kind of protected. That what we're aware of is really isolated to some very specialized areas of attention, right? Conscious awareness is attention. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that works. So you have this voluntary and involuntary system, okay? And when you're born, what happens, right? You're thrust out into the world. And now we don't know exactly how a newborn feels, but what does it look like? I mean, it looks like he's in some form of discomfort or pain, right? He's just usually crying. There's probably not a great sense of awareness of what's happening. And so basically, our nerves, right? Our nerves are this reporting and control mechanism. And again, a lot of it just sort of happens automatically, but some of it connects directly to our conscious awareness. So the involuntary system is feeding in information to the voluntary system, and it's only feeding in certain kinds of information. And then you think about, okay, signals, right? They're just signals that are coming in. And how do these signals announce themselves to us? What kind of signals will we get? Well, usually the signals that are reporting in, like, the state of our physiology. And maybe it's hunger, maybe it's... So what does it look like, these signals, right? That when we receive them into conscious awareness, we're aware of these signals. What is that? How do you think they announce themselves to us? Is it kind of like this spreadsheet that pops up for a newborn? Like, okay, our body temperature, and oh, we probably use a little more protein, some more carbohydrates. Like, is that what? No. It announces itself to us in the form of pain. So we get thrust out into the world. We have this nervous system. We come online. And our nervous system announces itself, like it declares to us that, hey, we're out here in the world. We are separate. We are vulnerable. And we have needs. And that's communicated through the sensation of pain. And when you think about it, Antonio Damasio, a neurologist, he wrote a book called Feelings. And he says that our nerves communicate to us through the sensation of feeling. And he was very specific about the feelings, like the need to eat, the need for warmth, these survival impulses. Now, feelings are not neutral, right? Feelings are a message to do something. They are biased messaging. When you're in pain, you kind of have this panic, right? Like, you don't know what to do. I'm in pain. You feel like this, something's wrong. I need to do something. It captures your attention. So you come into the world filled with pain, and that is what shapes your sense of who you are. So, okay, so let's think about that. We receive signals that are announced to us through pain. This pain presents to us an urging, a motivation. And what's happening is that we're creating these maps, what's called an internal representation of self. And there's two very important things to know about this internal representation. The first thing is that this representation is based upon an urge to do something. It's built upon a foundation of feeling and motivation. You could even call it's built upon a platform of movement, because it's driving you towards action of some kind. So it's built upon a platform of feeling. All your sensory data, the data that you pay attention to, is it's selected with an intention. It's like if you're building a spreadsheet, you don't just throw every piece of, put in like the color of your shirt, and then like the spreadsheet is there for a purpose. Like I remember I used to manage inventory. And so on that spreadsheet, I would have all the items I was managing, and then all the sales that we had, and how the products draw from the inventory, right? It was a very specific sheet with information that's organized in a very specific way. There was an intention behind it. So receiving these signals, we organize them around an intention. So there's an intention to the interpretive model. And the second thing to be aware of is that it's not direct. It's not totally accurate necessarily. It's an approximation. It's not like I can see directly into my toe and know exactly what's happening. No, I depend on the nerves that are in my toe to know what the state of my toe is. These are estimations. They're a best guess. And all of our perceptions, these nerve firings, the nerves, you can call them interoceptions, right? Our internal feelings. They create this representation of self, and that representation of self is simply an estimation. We're guessing. We don't know for sure. Just like a pilot looks at the fuselage and hopes that the instrumentation is correct. Now the dial might be broken. He doesn't actually have a direct, like he's not looking into the fuselage, but like looking into the gas tank, the fuel tank, and being like, oh yeah, it's about half full. No, he depends on his dials, and that's the same way with our senses, that they're just approximations. So we're building these models, and when you're first born, these models are pretty primitive. Like they're very low. You call them low resolution. These are pains that are just unidentified for the most part. I mean, you know what it feels like when you have an unidentified pain. You're like, well, it must be a tumor, and I'm gonna die in 6 months or so. That's what I do. But like, they're unidentified, and what you're frantically, urgently trying to do is you're trying to map these desires, these panes onto a specific desire. You're trying to identify. It's this game of identification. And you're always trying to improve your map. So you're creating, you could say, an internal, right, this internal representation. You're kind of creating this avatar, right? You're kind of creating like a character. Because again, this is an approximation. You're using this instrument, all these signals, right? You're paying attention only to the signals that provide you with the framework to help you fill the pain that you have, to help you like relieve the pain that you have. And so you have this internal representation of your desires. You have internal representation of the state of your physiology. And these are approximations. You're kind of hypothesizing. You don't exactly know what the signals mean. You're receiving signals, and through trial and error and through your parents helping you and other people helping you, doctors, whatever it is, they're helping you match the meaning to the signal in order for you to understand what you need to satisfy this pain. What do I do with this pain, with this desire, right? You're building out this character. It's an approximation. You could think of it like, it's kind of like a fiction. Like you don't really know. You're guessing. You're guessing about who you are, right? And then what's happening? You're looking out. You're getting all these exteroceptions as well. Now, the brain doesn't actually see. Okay, you don't just open your eyes and you just see things. Your brain is just receiving electrical signals, some kind of impulses through the neurons in your eyes, and it's just hitting some part of the brain, and you instinctually know that you need to organize this visual field. Again, just like you're getting these interoceptions and organizing them around a purpose, you do the same thing with your exteroceptions. You're getting these signals and you're organizing them around a purpose, just like that Excel spreadsheet. You're fitting these little bytes of data together, learning to arrange them in such a way that your visual field is able to tell you how to get the thing that you need, because you're in pain, right? You're motivated by pain. Your exterior visual field, shockingly, is just an approximation. I mean, I guess we kind of know this, but like we can look at some examples, but what's happening is that you have to learn to see objects. You have to learn to understand that there's depth and that you are a physical object and how you move through the world, how the world interacts with you. And almost every single perception that you have has a very specific neuron dedicated to it. There's something called border neurons. Border neurons help you understand the concept of like a wall. The location of walls is regulated by a very specific neuron. Like you might think, oh, I see these walls. Obviously the walls are that far. It's like, no. If we zap your border neurons, you're like, where are the walls? And you'd be like running into walls all day. You wouldn't be able to understand the concept of like how a room is enclosed by a border without a border neuron. So like if I put a blindfold on, if I destroyed your border neurons and put a blindfold on, you would just have no concept of where the walls are. It's really hard to understand that. Like I can't even conceptualize it, but they've identified these are border neurons. Your visual space is constructed. That these signals hit your brain and there is an interpreter inside. This interpreter is driven by consciousness, by feelings. So what's that mean? You're building a world, right? You're kind of like approximating this world around you. You're kind of telling a story, right? I mean, isn't that kind of a story? Like you have your character, this avatar. You have an internal sense of your action potential, because that's what you want to know, because you know that you have to get what you want, get what you need from the world, which is going to require some amount of energy. Some action is going to trigger your ability to get to acquire the reward, the thing that you need, right? The target of your desire. You also need to identify that target. And so you're building out this world, you're building out this character, you have the motive, you're building it out according to a motivation. I mean, what does that sound like? That's a world, that's a character, that's a motivation. That's a story. And then you exist in time, obviously. you're building out these contextualized models, and that these models are inherently estimations, which means that they're inherently predictive. And one thing that's really interesting about the brain is that there's a huge amount of resource dedicated to movement. That most of the brain is dedicated to movement of some kind. In fact, there's some theories that that say that the best way to understand the prefrontal cortex, which is where you make all your decisions and your reasoning and how you think things through, it's best understood as premotor. Now, your motor cortex is where the action commands are executed or fired off. You have these strings of motor commands that you save up. You have this little toolbox of movements, like you memorize, just like when you walk. You know, for a while when you were born, walking was fucking hard, man. You were like, damn, this left foot, and then when I do the right foot, and then it's like. But now it's just you have that motor command stored up, and it just runs. You don't have to think about it anymore, right? Just like when you tie your shoes, you store up string commands. That's the motor cortex. So you have this toolbox of motor strings stored up. I think it might be the premotor cortex, but then you have this whole other outgrowth, right? It's like your motor, premotor, and then prefrontal, this big frontal lobe, and this whole thing is dedicated to action planning. Your brain is essentially premotor. And in fact, like when you compare physical activity to mental activity and you're measuring like the brain's activity, what consumes the most neural resources, it's movement by far. It's executed movement, but then it's also imagined movement. Like you're already fabricating, right? Like you're kind of already guesstimating, fabricating who you are, what the world is, what your desires are. You don't exactly know. You just have these signals, right? I mean, have you ever like really wanted something and then you got it and you're like, this isn't what I wanted. Like you completely mismatched. You were just you were living in a dream world. You didn't know. And so then you improve your map. So you fabricate these worlds and you're somehow very, very able to create other fabrications in your mind, and you're able to imagine the performance of actions that you are kind of testing out to see if it will fulfill the desire that you're trying to get. That it will allow you to acquire the target that will fulfill your desire. Well, A, you're hoping that the target will actually fulfill your desire, and then B, you're hoping that the action sequence that you imagine will result in a successful acquisition, right? So you're the entire prefrontal cortex, the orbital, the medial, the dorsal, all these lobes, all these areas are part of it's called an action hierarchy. And it's like you imagine all these different movements. You have all these stored up scenarios called scripts in your head that you use to like make decisions that will eventually result in an action. And all that is just to say, not only do you tell the story of who you are in the moment, right? Like, I'm hungry, I'm not hungry, I'm going to be hungry in 2 hours, right? These are all like based on internal representations of signals. I'm in the world, I'm in a pizza store, I'm in it, right? You tell that fabricated story, this, you could call it a hallucination, but you also are able to tell multiple other stories, that your brain is just geared to tell stories because you're trying to figure out what the right story is. You're trying to update your stories, and then you're trying to match an action pattern to like the plot of the story. So like you're basically all of who you are, your physiology is a storytelling machine. Because the nature of being is in fact a story. The structure of being is a story. You are a character. You have a motivation, right? You have feelings. I assume you have feelings. And you're somewhere. You're in a world that has certain characteristics to it. Some of it you understand, some of it you don't. Some of which you're actually getting wrong. You know, you think that if you walk off a cliff, you're gonna just keep walking, that you'll be fine, but no, you're gonna die, right? I mean, this. So when you're crossing the street, you think the car is approaching at a certain speed, but it's actually much faster than you thought, or whatever. When we watch movies, our brains are incredibly active. They're so active in a movie. We're trying to understand scenarios. We're trying to understand causal relationships. We're being very selective of the information that we're taking in. We're not so concerned about like how like the exact arrangement of sand on the ground. Like we don't pay attention to that, or like how many leaves are on that tree that the character say. We don't look at that at all because it's not relevant to our spreadsheet, right? We selectively engage with the things that might be relevant to our story. And when we watch a movie, we watch it to relax, but actually our brain is super active. But it just means that like we relax with story, that we are made. Our physiology is built around story. Our primary survival strategy, the way our physiology is coordinated, and indeed the very nature of our existence is in fact story. We were The world is a story. I don't know if it's right. We can argue whether or not there's a storyteller or if it's a conscious design or whatever, but it technically is this. It's arranged in this structure that we know as story because we're a character in a setting with a motivation. If we have feelings, we have a motivation. Feelings are biased messaging. It's not just like cold data. It impulses you to move. It impulses you towards action. So in that sense, we do see some convergence between this top-down approach and this bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach would say that we operate within a narrative framework. You could call it a narrative framework. That's a technical way of looking at it. And the way we communicate the deepest parts of who we are, of our existence, is in the form of a narrative. That we live biologically, coordinate through a narrative, but that we also interpret everything around us through a narrative. And we instinctively are looking for the narrative that explains us the most in the deepest way possible. And we get it wrong constantly, right? We don't really know. Again, we are approximating and guesstimating everything, and we do it together. How we perceive things, how we understand things, we're constantly looking towards each other to share resources as a way to gather more information. We're constantly trying to gather more information. So I think it is reasonable to say that probably the search for meaning will result in some kind of narrative that we adopt. Who we are, why we are, what we're doing here, what is the world. Now, the next question would be, what narrative is likely to be the most fulfilling? Like, based on our design, what is the narrative that our physiology is what's the narrative that our physiology is pointing towards? Is there a narrative that is pointing towards? It's probably not pointing towards the narrative of we just sit here and do nothing. That's probably not right. We seem geared towards action. We're constantly impulsed towards action. So we're supposed to acquire resources. We're supposed to go out and find the thing that we need, right? You could say that's part of the design. We were meant to go out and get the thing that we need. We're mobile. We have this very complex storytelling machine, right, that's able to imagine multiple scenarios, and we dedicate a ton of resources to it, and we instinctively are drawn to it. We're always drawn to stories. So how do we know that the Campbell narrative, this grand narrative, is in fact the highest narrative of our physiology? Well, to do that, we should look at what does our physiology want to do? Like, what are we being enticed to do? We are inbuilt with these feelings that seem to be common across all people. Food, water, oxygen, right? Those are some basic ones that I think we can agree that we all want. So there seems to be some kind of common narrative to the organism. Now, when we get into more abstract things, it gets more difficult to understand, okay, what were we all built for? But we have a system a system that regulates desire. And in fact, it's built upon a platform of feelings. But when we go out and we scan the world, yeah, so it's an exteroceptive system. Yeah, this will be interesting to try to explain. So basically, when we're assessing these different feelings, right, these different signaling from our nervous system, which comes to us in the form of feelings, when we're assessing these feelings, we have this integrative structure or consciousness that's able to take the signals and arrange them into some kind of hierarchy, where some signals we know that aren't that important, whereas some signals we know are urgent, and then some signals are kind of on this time schedule. Like we know we need to sleep, we know we need to eat, right? But there's a sense that the basic survival impulses are there for a purpose. They're there to fuel these more abstract desires. And we know that because we have them. When we think about all these different desires, and there's this interplay between our interoceptions of what we have this feeling, and then we look out into the world, and sometimes the world reveals to us a need that we didn't know we had because we didn't know it existed, right? There's some kind of interplay between character setting and motivation. Between character setting and motivation, that each of these three elements, they're part of like this three-legged stool. They're what's the best way? They're like in this triangle where they all talk and interact with each other. And what happens is like sometimes when you're in the world, you see something, and you go, "Oh my God, that's what I've always wanted," and you suddenly become aware of this need. And then you understand that that's something that will fulfill a deeper desire and raise your level of being, I guess you could say. And it's like, well, for every sensation that you have, there is a system regulating it. And it's kind of like, well, what is that system that regulates desire? How do you rank desire? How do you prioritize? How do you know which ones are more important and which ones are less important? Well, we have some grasp on this actually from a physiological standpoint, a neurological standpoint. That system is called the dopamine system, the dopaminergic system. And dopamine is what Andrew Huberman, you may know him, he's a famous Stanford neurologist. He says dopamine is the currency of the universe. In fact, all desires are regulated by dopamine. And so it's like you may think you want money, but you only want money because you have this internal representation in mediated by dopamine attached to money. Like, and for everyone, it's a little bit different. $1 million to Bill Gates is probably like this probably a flat line. It probably makes no difference to him at all. Whereas $1 million to me is like, whoa, that's a pretty big dopamine hit. If I suddenly had it, if I woke up tomorrow morning and found $1 million in my bank account, I'd be like, oh my God, I get this huge dopamine hit. So it's not, in some sense, it's not really the money. It's the meaning it's like the desire that I attach to the money. And that's kind of like I guess it's probably largely an unconscious process. It's not like I decided that I like money. I just realized that I do like money because I have this understanding of what money can do, and it can ensure my survival better. It protects me. It also affords me social status, right? I have this internal sense of what money does. Now, that may or may not be accurate. Again, we're just approximating. I have a narrative attached to money, and that narrative is driven by dopamine. So, now what's interesting about dopamine, as I say that, again, the prefrontal cortex, from an extreme view, you can even say the whole brain, but it's like it's driven by story, that it's designed to construct a narrative that allows you to function in the world such that you can acquire the things that you desire. You can fulfill your needs, right? and therefore it's action oriented. That it's purpose, motivation, it's action oriented. And what's really interesting is that the same system that regulates energy. Energy is what allows you to perform actions, both neural energy and somatic energy, bodily energy. That system is the same system that regulates desire. Dopamine is the core component, is the raw material for both movement and for mediating, assessing, prioritizing, organizing desire. It's an integrative system. And so the more you want something, the more energy you get. You know, for guys, I mean, you see a cute girl walk by, suddenly, like, if you were sleepy, you just wake up and you just get this energy, and it feels so good because it's propelling you forward towards something that you want. Dopamine and so desire and action are completely part of the same thread. And so, why was I saying that? And so, right, and so you can, right, dopamine is exteroceptive. It's more about what you need out there. When you survey the world, when you're sensing the world, it's trying to find the things that you need. And so, right, and so just to say, this dopamine system is core to our survival strategy. It's a key way in which we coordinate ourselves with the world. It guides, it regulates, it motivates, it helps us to assess, it helps us to assign value. It's a map of value to the world and helps understand what we should pursue. And so basically the dopamine is this incentivization system. It's an inducement system. And in some sense, the dopamine system is, let's say, consciously constructed. In some sense it is. But in a lot of ways, our dopamine system is a mystery to us. We don't exactly know what's going to give us the highest dopaminergic reward. And it's kind of like a discovery process. We need to discover what is out there in the world that matches our particular dopamine regulation system. But there are some consistencies across organisms, across humans, that trigger larger amounts of dopamine. So one way you could determine the purpose of the design of this organism, of how we've been shaped to adapt to the world, what the world is motivating us, how it shaped our dopamine system and motivating us to do, is to figure out what sorts of activities, what sorts of scenarios deliver the highest and most sustained dopamine rewards. Right? I mean, that could be one way of looking at it. What is the system, like, unconsciously incentivizing us to do? What's the carrot? Where are we being led? And so there's an experiment that's been done where they were able to transcranially stimulate all these different areas of the brain that elicited certain sensations. You know, certainly sexual pleasure is one of them, intoxication, I think anger was one. There's all these different areas. And they were just trying to figure out, okay, well, what do people like the most? And so, like, they set someone down with all these different, like, things on their head, and different buttons stimulated different areas of their brain. And they're just trying to figure out, okay, what do people constantly press? What's the most stimulated area of the brain? And so they kind of do the experiment, and you would think it'd be the sexual one, right? We're supposed to pass on our genes or something like that. It's actually not sexual stimulation. That there's an area of the brain that is so pleasurable that it's more positively reinforcing than sexual stimuli. I can't even imagine that. I can't really imagine it. But there is an area. It's actually in the midline thalamus. It's called the oh fuck, I forgot the name of this thing. It's a funky name. It reminds me of the sunset. But anyways, it's in the midline thalamus. You tickle it. It's connected to the dopamine system, and the feeling is mild frustration combined with anticipation. So it's actually not really a good feeling, pleasurable, but it is incredibly addictive, and it's pleasurable in a weird way. It's like when a girl's flirting with you and you don't know if she likes you, but you're being drawn in deeper, right? It's kind of like that. But they notice that this midline thalamus, this area lights up in rats under certain conditions. And or like when they stimulate this area, it inspires a certain kind of behavior in rats. And what they do is that they begin to explore into unknown territory, particularly towards fear stimuli. Midline thalamus, when you tickle this area, they start moving towards fear. And they don't run crazy into fear, like they, like stupidly into fear. What they do is they voluntarily begin to cautiously explore. They become drawn. They become almost like called towards this unexplored territory that might contain danger. And they start to tail flick, which is like it indicates a level of danger, that they're ready for action. And so it kind of fills their senses with a sense of anticipation that they're going to be entering into something dangerous, but that might contain some kind of reward, that there's an anticipatory aspect. So they call it voluntary approach towards fear stimuli. That actually produces the most sustained, the most addictive, the most attractive, the most desired dopaminergic release. Voluntary exploration towards fear stimuli. So you could say that that's the purpose of the design. I mean, if that's the most motivating feeling, I guess that's what we're being most inspired to do, that we are designed to enter, to voluntarily explore unknown territories with the potential for danger. To voluntarily approach fear. Looks like that's what our physiology is pointed to. Okay, well, what does the hero's journey say? Well, the hero's journey, right, it says morality, transformation, transcendence, that these are the elements, but they are accomplished through a narrative pattern. And the narrative pattern is departure, initiation, and return. Departure, that you leave behind what's familiar. What does that mean? You enter into unknown territory. He calls it the special world. And that the hero enters into the special world through a call, that there's a calling, right? This midline, the tail flicking, right? The stimulation, you get called hypnotically. Sometimes you're tricked into it. That's according to these different narrative patterns of how the main character enters into the special world. Sometimes he's sort of tricked, but he's usually called, or sometimes there's some great catastrophe that motivates him in there, because again, it's a fearful, like, you don't necessarily want to go in there unless maybe you have to, because you could die in there. That's, as far as you know, it's unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. Departure, you depart what you know. You're called towards the unknown, but you have this instinct that it's for a purpose, that is to fulfill something with a great reward. There's a high anticipation aspect to it. Again, the midline thalamus, dopamine, is anticipatory rewards. You approach, and then initiation is you encounter a number of difficulties and struggles. And so far, for me, I mean, it kind of seems like there is some convergence between the top down of what we kind of instinctively as a collective perceive, perhaps, these stories that get elevated to the top of consciousness and persist, and that we are able to unify, that it unifies people together because we all share the same fascination and intriguement or whatever with this type of narrative, right? And that seems to be appropriate to our design. that our physiology actually points towards that type of narrative pattern, which is what? It's a contextual, it's an action pattern based upon a context. The context is familiar to unfamiliar, movement towards danger, and the action pattern is we answer that call, right? That's the action pattern. We tell that in the form of a fantastical story, but there is some overlap there. So there is some kind of biological instantiation towards this narrative pattern that we seem to keep telling over and over again, no matter what the culture. The commonality is that we're all humans, and that we have a similar physiology, and that we're in the same world. We're subject to the same forces, you know? So that concludes part 2. We're going to build on this, but I think it went pretty well. So yeah, I'm really happy with this. Cool. All right, thanks guys.